Never use the King James Version of the Bible to form or choose spiritual beliefs because it is the least accurate, widely available version of the Bible on the market. I'm routinely asked why, so let's get into it. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. One of the most common misconceptions is that because the King James Version is an older translation, that it is more accurate. Because people feel like the distance between Jesus and the King James Version being translated makes it more accurate, when in fact, it makes it less accurate. And that's because since the King James Version was translated, we've had a lot of archaeological finds that have produced much earlier, much older manuscripts of the Bible than the King James Version was based on. That means we have a much more accurate idea of what the original manuscripts of the Bible were. And we don't have any of those original manuscripts, none of them. We don't have any of them that Paul or Moses or anybody else wrote. What we have is copies of copies of copies of those. And we have much older copies than the King James Version was based on. And there's an easy place that you can see this. Just go to the end of the book of Mark in the King James Version. You'll see a long passage that talks about things like holding snakes and drinking poison. Since the King James Version was translated, we have learned that none of that passage was included in the original text. It was just added at one point during the copying process, and it never existed before then. And so, in any reliable modern translation, you'll find that passage grayed out in brackets, or at the end of that, a little asterisk, and at the bottom it says, this actually wasn't in any real older translations. And that's not the only passage like that. There's a bunch of them, which means if you're trying to base Christian spiritual beliefs on the King James Version of the Bible, you're going to be basing some of them potentially on verses that don't exist in the actual Bible. The other problem is that words just don't mean the same thing today as they did when the King James Version was around. For example, you'll see the word charity. Now, when we hear the word charity, we think of the people that we give money to that are doing some really great work in the world. But actually, that word should be translated as love in the modern English language. But there's even more complicated examples than that. So in Jude chapter 22, there's a classic example of this. In Jude chapter 22, it says, but on some have compassion, making a difference. Now, that phrase, making a difference, we think of like, oh, having an impact, right? I'm gonna go on a trip and help people who were victims of a hurricane, and I'm gonna make a difference in the world. But that definition of the phrase, make a difference, actually wasn't the definition until the 1900s. In the King James time, that phrase, make a difference, meant make a distinction, like make a distinction between one or another person. So if you take that from the King James Version and you try to put it into modern terms, it would say, basically, it would be saying, have compassion on people, but be careful on whom. Make a distinction between the people that you are having compassion on. However, that is still not an accurate translation because there was a change in the copying of that verse that changes the object of that term, compassion. And what happens then is it's actually talking about people who are having doubts, like people who are making a distinction, who are having questions and doubts. And it says, but on them, like have compassion on people who have questions and who are sort of making their own, figuring things out with their faith. That is a completely different understanding, not only of the appropriate sort of modern English interpretation of what the King James says, but definitely on what a normal modern reader would understand when they read the King James English. And that means it's a really bad idea to use the King James Version to understand who God is in the Christian tradition or to form any kind of spiritual belief. And then let's talk about the language. People are like, oh, but I love the way it sounds. It sounds, I don't know, classic, like Shakespeare, but it's actually not. It's not Shakespearean English. The King James Version has this very stilted and strange version of English because they took the format, the like order of the words from the original language and put the English words in that order, which makes it hard to understand and not make as much sense. And here's the thing, when it came out, when it was released, one of the main problems, one of the main criticisms was that people said it didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like the way people talked. People have never spoken like the King James Version speaks, which is also an interesting piece. And if you want to know which version of the Bible you should be using, if you're looking for the most accurate, Bible scholars, the people who can actually make that call for you, they're unanimous. It is the academic consensus is that the New Revised Standard Updated Edition is the most accurate English translation of the Bible. I also like a translation called the CEB that is very accurate, but it's a little bit more readable than the NRSVUE. But either of those would be a good place to start.